All right, ladies and gentlemen, let's talk Warlords Battlecry 3. We did it in 3 streams. We finished it on the 3rd of July. The game was released in 2004, not 2003, but you can't have everything be 3. We did hunt down 3 keys, we killed 3 of Gorgon's generals, we probably needed 3 takes to finish the last level, for all I remember. It was a 3 game, dude. It was living up to its fucking name. So, Battlecry 3, the 3rd game in the Battlecry franchise, the last one as well. One of the things that I want to get squared away right to begin with, as we set out to do the review, is I let it stew over the 4th of July. I took some time to consider the title. I would have reviewed it sooner if not for some other events related to the 4th of July. But now we're off the holiday, and I wanted to discuss basically why I ran the franchise to begin with. It's because I had past experience with it. I played it when I was very, very young. And it was one of my father's favorite RTS titles. Probably I think the second game was probably his favorite. But overall, that was what got me interested in the franchise to begin with when I was younger. And then as I grew older and as I started playing RTS titles, StarCraft, custom campaigns, and all that stuff on my YouTube channel, I realized, hey, this is one of the titles that I can run. And so I think it was in the middle of early on this year or very late last year, I don't really remember, is when I started the playthrough of the first title. That was offline, and then I streamed the second game. We had a bit of a hiatus in the middle of that, and here we banged this one out in 3 days, so it was nice and quick, at least by comparison. And so, not, I guess, as much content in terms of the running time as the second title, but at the end of my playthrough, I did go back and play as a merchant instead of a Death Knight. And I had started the game out as a Demon Death Knight, completed it relatively quickly, had the RPG experience, as one of the chatters had pointed out. Forget how to say your name, dude, sorry, but you know who you are. And generally speaking, I feel like if I hadn't gone back and done a little bit as a merchant for like 2 hours at the end of the playthrough, if I hadn't really tried to experience what this game was like when you had to mass out units, you had to build supply depots, you had to build, your stuff as the Dark Dwarves, and you had to actually engage with the game's RTS mechanics and basically have your hero sort of just as a more conventional hero unit, and then hide them in. Obviously, I was using the Iron Man mode, so if I had a bad run, it was sort of like you weren't defeated when you lost your hero, but it was effectively the same thing because you lost all your hero bonuses and you lost them forever. And so the benefit was that we sort of fast tracked in those 2 hours. We were able to experience more of the game as a result because we were playing at a higher level, and so I didn't mind setting the difficulty higher or continuing to play as Dark Dwarves, and so the racial difficulty scaled up higher because I was always playing as the same race pretty much, besides I think 1 or 2 times. So that was an instance where I was able to experience more of the game than maybe other people would if they had just started out and they weren't really sure what they were doing and they were playing as a merchant for some reason. I'm not really sure what I would recommend if you were just getting into the game. You had no past experience with it besides maybe watching a couple of playthroughs of a couple of different people and then listening to this review somehow, and you miraculously got this information. I don't know what I would recommend to you as a first run. Maybe it would be more apropos to play as a Death Knight or some sort of warriors that can just face tank and take a lot of damage. Really, I think it suits, this game has the material in it to suit a bunch of different playstyles, but you do have to do some work for the game developers. You have to do some work to make sure that you have the maximum amount of fun out of it. And so there is a certain element of customization that goes beyond just customizing your hero. You have to sort of customize parts of the game that in very roundabout ways, in ways that they didn't really offer the same kind of facilitation. It's more of an exploit, or maybe that's not the wrong term for it, but it's not necessarily intentional that the room for that exists, at least as far as I can reverse engineer from the developers. And Battlecry 3 is certainly a game that tries to appeal to a bunch of different playstyles, tries to facilitate a bunch of different kinds of players enjoying the title, and as a result fails to offer a coherent experience for any one kind of playstyle. There's going to be things that suck you out of the narrative. There's going to be things that suck you out of the experience of playing the game. And obviously story was not really a big focus for the developers. But despite that, the fact that you're playing as a game, the fact that you're engaging in a role-playing experience where you're pretending to be, you're role-playing as a character, a leader, a hero, and running the show from that perspective in a top-down RTS gameplay or isometric view or whatever, that is going to be sabotaged to some degree by the fact that you don't have the ability to have a cogent experience that from start to finish is, doesn't ever really have a break in the characterization of the setting. You don't have these weird spikes where one mission's much harder, one mission's much easier. admittedly, there really wasn't that much difficulty even on the highest level where the AI was cheating to a significant degree. Maybe that would have changed if I had played a little bit deeper into the game as a merchant, because again, then you wouldn't be able to speedrun the game basically and rush down a bunch of the enemy AIs. But I have a feeling that with enough of a points in merchant mercantilism, I don't know how you would say that, whatever the buff was that reduced the cost of your units. I have a feeling that with enough of a focus on that, you would be able to raise an army that would very quickly compared to your opponents, even with their cheating resources, and you would have been able to find success there. And so I don't necessarily think that the gameplay here offers enough of a challenge for a player of my admittedly low caliber at the grand scheme of things. So I don't think that my skill level is unattainable for the average Joe. I don't think that my past RTS experience necessarily informed a lot of my success in this one, because the heroes do take a significant portion of the gameplay, and the sort of micromanagement that you have to do. You have to be using your hero pretty actively, at least when you are going to be playing a hero that is going to be on the field and not in a tower for the majority of the playthrough. And so, like, even when you're not doing that, the amount of RNG and the amount of random chance variables that take control away from you as a player are going to make it so that even if this were a conventional RTS and you were playing it like a conventional RTS, like StarCraft, where you don't really using heroes, you're keeping them in bunkers, essentially, and you're just going to be marshalling a bunch of large-scale forces, that still is going to be much harder for you to maintain a coherent show the entire time. And that's where it comes down to is there's not really that much consistency within the game. And depending on which way you go, which missions you do first, which missions you do last, that's obviously going to be impacting your the end result, the ending experience. Like, some of the end game missions were much easier than the missions that I was doing halfway through the playthrough, for example. And especially like all of the missions that involved collecting those 3 keys were very, very trivial. And of course, with enough of a rush, the very half-assed took you 5 seconds to make 30-minute defense mission that they closed the entire campaign with was very, very trivial as well. And so there's really not a whole lot of difficulty, and the difficulty that is there is usually artificial, like spawning in units or cheating AI, and tends not to lend itself to really a great experience when you are paying attention to those things. If you're more focused on your own play, you're less focused on the AI's, essentially the fallacy or the folly of the developers when it comes to their AI levels, their scripting, the layouts of the maps, whether or not they even have AI in some missions, as you noticed by like the troll mission, for example, which only had 1 AI and then just a billion pre-placed trolls, which was hilarious. And the of course the final mission, which was very much of a letdown, of a very big, very underwhelming climax to the entire thing, if you could call it a climax at all. All of these different sort of elements, all of these different pieces to this puzzle lead you to believe that this is not a very coherent playthrough. There's a certain element of schizophrenic level design where the difficulty constantly rocked back and forth, the scale constantly rocked back and forth. You don't really have even if the difficulty was, sort of trivialized in certain respects by your heroes, you can say that, oh, maybe, Pronigo, you had a much easier time than most people because of the fact that you used a death knight, you rushed them down, you didn't let them get up and use those cheating resources that you were talking about earlier. Well, maybe that is the case, but the scale of the missions was often going up and down and up and down. And for example, the final mission doesn't have any scale to it; just has some spawned-in enemies. There's plenty of room for 2-3 enemies that and that's kind of what I was hoping for. What I was expecting is a finale that would pit, 3-4 demons, maybe 2 demons and an undead. I don't know. We even have a dialogue that says something to the effect of Gorgon has undead and demons at his disposal. And so, like, really seeing these, the legions of death and legions of demons, that would be really cool to see them attacking you in this final mission. Maybe you expand the map from the last time we were here so that there's more room for that sort of thing. I'm sure all this stuff was possible in the engine, and they just elected not to do it for some reason. And this is a game that received patches after its release, so even though it's not necessarily what you would expect for them to patch out single-player content and make it so that there's, entire redesigns of missions or something, that still would have been an opportunity that the developers could have taken to improve their missions, I think. Maybe there was some political shit behind the scenes where they locked out the campaigns and you were only allowed to patch multiplayer. I don't know. I don't know what Ubisoft would have said to that effect if they. I just assumed that it wasn't something that they thought about. I just assumed that they never bothered to go back and patch some stuff out. Maybe I could be mistaken, and they actually did update certain missions, in which case it's even more unforgivable that they didn't update their finale. But definitely something that I would like to have seen done much better. And I guess we'll have to see if there are any changes when I go back and play, if I decide to play the vanilla campaign using the Protectors mod, which is something that I'll talk a little bit more about towards the end of our review, our end of our time together. So I think that on top of the fact that the scale was going up and down, and say what you will about the difficulty, whether or not I did trivialize certain missions by the fact that I was rushing them down with a Death Knight, the fact that the scale was constantly in question, and the fact that a lot of the missions were sort of expecting you to either summon a bunch of enemy or of allies, summon a bunch of units that you could then fight skirmishes with, like, if you just have your hero and nobody else, summon a bunch of guys or just 1v1 them, like the Death Knight. Like, think of the Bartonian Joust or whatever that was called, where you had to go and in order to lead the knights, you had to, or maybe it wasn't the knights, but there was some title that you could get in order to lead the barbarians. You had to 1v1 a bunch of guys, or 1v4 or something like that. Situations like this is where I think to myself, like, what if I was a merchant in those situations? I just wouldn't be able to win those missions, like, unless I was really, really well geared, or I went down a different skill path when I was upgrading myself, and I increased, strength and dexterity or something, instead of what you would want in those situations would be charisma, maybe some intelligence for extra troop XP. There's really not much of a justification for changing that out, but you're just disbarred the ability to have those levels completed as a merchant, or as some of these other weaker heroes that can't hold up in a 1v1. A necromancer, for example, that maybe is not well kitted, like in the second campaign for the second game's run, I had a necromancer that was not specialized properly, that I poorly spec'd in that sense. And so some of the blame can fall on the player in that case if they do poorly specialize their hero. But I actually feel like at least a handful of classes, even if there was a small handful, would be completely disbarred from winning those sorts of engagements. I don't think the hero themselves gets the bonus of their own morale. I think that has to be transferred to other units. So you'd have to find some way to bring other units with you, and I don't know if that would be possible whatsoever. You'd have to find some gear that gives you, some sort of ability. Like there's certain weapons or armors that give you magic points, like give you a couple points in pyromancy or something. Something like that might help you tilt the scales, but that's down to RNG. That's down to whatever the enemies drop. And really just perplexing, I guess, at the end of the day. Not really sure how they would do that. It goes back to my idea of this game not really being designed with a specific playstyle in mind. Instead, they tried to appeal to all sorts of different playstyles, and of course alienated some on the fringes as a result in certain, niche edge cases, we'll say, which would be like the jousts and the challenges. Of course, the ambushes were entirely AGLs. There was no real justification for them. At the very least, you could disable them if you were allied to the particular race. So if you led the Swarm, if you led the Plague Lords, if you led... I think maybe if you controlled the Griffin eggs, you might not deal with the Griffins anymore. And of course, if you were allied with the Fae, you would not get ambushed by Fae anymore. So stuff like that, like I like the fact that you could control that to some degree, but there was never any worthwhile combat. It was always a chore to deal with the fact that you were being ambushed. It was never something that you really felt like you were engaging with worthwhile content that was not wasting your time. It was definitely an artificial game lengthener. It was definitely something that was just there to pad the running time, it seems. Maybe they had some idea for that would have been better. Maybe they had an idea for the gameplay that would have made those particular missions a little bit less obnoxious to deal with, but just a little bit less of a chore. But I don't know. At the end of the day, I can only review what I played, and I played something that had artificially game lengthening ambushes. Just chores for you to do. Item management was another thing that I thought was really silly. There's a lot of trash items that you're sort of compelled to grab and then sell, even though crowns, you're never really at unless you like spend it all on buying soldiers, which I didn't really engage with, like the mercenary groups that you could choose to bring with you, and I think they disband after you use them in one battle or something like that. But we didn't really engage with that content, so I won't speak too much about that. Unless you bought all of the mercenary groups that you could and spent all of your money on XP, you were never really short on crowns, even if you used like the 30 crown extra army points every time. And I'm not really sure why spending crowns would allow you to take in more troops. I don't know what the internal like in-universe logic for that is. It's just like, oh, we have to have the player be able to spend this money somehow, so I guess this is one way to do it. And of course they had this in the second game as well, but still very silly, still very strange. And carrying items was a chore. Cycling items between your inventory and your stash in the main campaign menu was a chore. Selling items was a chore. There were so many different menus and with no keyboard shortcuts whatsoever, at least as far as I'm aware, that were just very poorly designed. And you'd think that if you playtested and you did this yourself and you realized, oh shit, this is really annoying to do every single time, you would have fixed it. But apparently they didn't. Either they didn't playtest it or they disagree with the idea that it is in fact a chore. I'm not sure. But that was definitely an issue that I had with this particular title is just stuff that lengthened the gameplay experience without engaging you with content. And it was like, item management's boring, and it's not something that anybody really wants to do. It's just a necessary evil that a lot of people who play RPGs, who play, say Baldur's Gate or something like that, like they might just assume, well, it's a necessary evil, you have to do it in some degree. But I'm sure there's a way to solve that, especially with this game. Like there's a couple of suggestions I had in the middle of playing the game that would have made this a lot more reasonable. I mean, for one, this isn't something that I came up with while I was playing, but is an idea that you could just have your stash at your home base or when you're in a tower or something. I don't know, like something where you can engage with the stash in the game would help mitigate that stuff. And of course, having something that I did definitely say at least once is having your stash there when you're selling items. Like you must have your stash with you at some point, because you're able to just exit the menu for selling the items or buying items in the first place and go to your stash immediately afterwards with 2 more clicks. So it's clearly like adjacent to you. So there's not really a reason for you to not just have your access to your stash and be able to sell items directly from your stash, which is what would solve that problem to some degree as well. So being able to have access to more inventory space in-game so that you were able to collect the trash items if you wanted to, and then being able to sell your items a lot easier would help alleviate some of the fact that you're dealing with this stuff. So anything would have been an assistance at this point. Anything would have helped not piss me off and not slow the game down and not create downtime for the player. But unfortunately, I think the whole concept of it is flawed to begin with. I don't really know how you would resolve it in a more higher level way, or like before you even reach these issues, resolve anything that creates them, fix it at the root instead of creating these band-aids, basically. Not sure how you would do that, but it's just another element of the game that left a sort of unsavory taste in my mouth. Now, I know I'm front-loading the experience with a lot of critique, a lot of criticism. I did want to say, I do have an attachment to the game from a subjective point of view. These are just objective critiques that I think you can levy at it, and you can't really come up with an argument. The only argument you can make is maybe subjectively it didn't bother you as much, but you can't say anything. You can't attack these critiques and say that they aren't, ringing objectively true. You might just disagree with the extent to which they interfere with your enjoyment of the game. Maybe you don't take it as serious as I do. Maybe it doesn't bother you as much as I do, and that's fine. Of course, I'm not going to argue with that. I myself did enjoy my time playing the game, that's for sure. But I can recognize that a lot of it is flawed, and my enjoyment could have been significantly more. In terms of a percentage of the running time of me playing the game, I could have enjoyed more of my time, a higher percentage of that time, if some of these issues were resolved. And, a lot of these issues are more on the objective side as opposed to the subjective side. I'm not complaining that, like, maybe the balance wasn't in my favor, and maybe my favorite race wasn't as good. Like, these aren't the nature of my complaints. And so I think that just adding a little bit of color there to help understand, people who are fans of this title, understandably, people who are niche and dedicated audiences in this particular case who want to see this game, spread out a little bit more, a bunch of people who had never seen the game came in and said, oh, what's this? That was interesting for me, and it was gratifying for me to be able to bring that kind of gameplay to people. Hopefully more of them check it out. Hopefully more of them become part of the modding scene as well, which to my understanding is actually where most of the players play now is, on the Protectors. But ultimately, I think that from more, objective standpoint, a lot of the objective critique that I had of the second title is still holding true in here. There's definitely a lot of recycled content. I did mention this earlier on with the in the playthrough. I was talking about how the audio, the sound files, the unit responses in particular of the units that they added in for the third game, a lot of them were really lackluster. And in that case, even if you were copying unit responses over, like, for example, the I am the Void guy for the Blackguard, if you feel that these unit responses are not evocative enough, like, I think that the I am the Void guy is fine, even though it's very silly. It has some character. It's definitely unique. It sets it apart from the other units in the game. But then you look at like the Iron Golem, where he goes, Iron Golem, and then the ready. Like, all of the golems were fucking annoying as hell. The Bronze Golem was probably the most, or the least offensive. And, you know, you can find a way, I think, to have a fantasy, the unit fantasy or power fantasy of using this unit that is a golem without making the voices really annoying and grating on the ears. And that's what this was. That's what it felt like, is just really annoying. And you can say, oh, it's kind of funny, but it loses its charm so quickly that I feel like it's your responsibility as the game dev to re-record a different set of unit responses with a more intelligent direction for, you know, placing that unit in the fantasy setting of Battlecry and having it so that we're not trying to gouge our ears out so that we don't have to listen to those guys anymore. Especially, you know, the last 2 hours of my playthrough where I played as a Dark Dwarf Merchant, I can attest to you that building, you know, hundreds of these things in a game really destroyed me. And so, not the biggest fan of that, of course. But of course, a lot of the new unit responses that were not recycled, that were created for this game, were also really bad. So you have this mismatch of quality where some of them, like the Blackguard, like even the Demon, even though he's kind of campy, like I could see him as one of, certainly offensive from a qualitative standpoint, but not nearly as bad as some of the others. You know, like, there's a lot of these that are middling to above average in terms of the unit responses, in terms of the quality, in terms of the character, and how emblematic they are of the unit. Like, some of this stuff is pretty good from the earlier titles. Then you go to the third game, and you have the Elephant Rider, who sounds like a soy boy in the medieval times, going, the people from up here look like ants. Ha! Like, wow. Yeah, you really sold the fantasy, dude. You really sound like an Elephant Rider. Come on. Come the fuck on. You can't play that shit with me. And so that's a situation where the unit responses of the new game are clashing with the old game. So you have some art, some, well, not visual art in this case, but some elements of the game that are clashing in that respect. And definitely should have been, I guess, held to a higher standard, held to the standard of the rest of the title. You still have a lot of sound effects that are recycled for sure. Obviously, still the impact sounds, still the a lot of the stuff that makes it really difficult for readability. There were a lot of cases actually where I really couldn't see the enemy units that I was in the middle of trying to kill. And a lot of times where you just had to deal with a lot of very strange visual and audible reads that definitely did not do a compelling job of communicating to the player what was happening. You also have still a lot of RNG, and it's entirely behind curtains. It's very seldom explained. You don't really have that much in the form of any sort of gameplay communication. There's no different sound effect or visual effect for when an attack misses, for when an attack is a mortal wound. You do have the critical strikes, and maybe the critical strike art is reused and sound effect is reused for the mortal wounds as well, which, to my understanding, still exist within the game at this point. But those were the only additions. There was nothing for missing. There was, and so at that point, there's still not a great amount of gameplay communication. It's still RNG, even if it was perfectly communicated to the player what happened when, which would certainly alleviate some of my complaints. It would not have fixed the fact that it's RNG and that it's totally anti-competitive, that you can't control for that. You have no idea whether or not you are going to hit or miss. And even when you have an absurd stats like 90 combat, like my Death Knight did at the end of the run, probably more than that at that point, you still are sometimes getting critically struck. You still are sometimes getting mortally wounded. You are still sometimes having your armor ignored and all of this other stuff. And so this is where, you don't really know what's going to happen. You don't really know whether or not you are going to critically strike, whether or not you aren't going to. And it just comes down to, again, RNG. Like, I don't understand that one, man. It reminds me of when I was playing League of Legends. I was Malphite top. I brought one, like the smallest percentage critical strike rune, and I crit a guy 3 times and killed him. Man, he was mad. I was mad. I was mad that I got it. Like, it doesn't feel good on either way. You can't control for that. It's just entirely random. And so, what's not entirely random is the motorcycles. I know that they're very noisy. I apologize for that. Thanks. So, just a lasting note. I know the RNG was like a hot button issue. And people were saying, well, RNG equals RPG, LOL. And it's like, okay, dude, you wrote 9 different fucking characters there. That's great. Thanks for all of the letters. But where's the substance in that? Why does an RPG have to have RNG? Why is there got to be some element of randomness that is anti-competitive, that does not allow you to control for it as a player, that really you can only minorly influence, as we saw demonstrated very to a crazy extent when I'm talking about those combat stats. Like I have to underscore how bad that was. I know a lot of people were saying, well, that's what an RPG is. That's what makes this game more interesting. I don't see it, man. I completely disagree. This might be a subjective issue again, but I think objectively, if you're trying to make an RTS that's meant to be competitive and you have this multiplayer, you're trying to have it be somewhat balanced, theoretically anyways, unless it's just not your domain as the developer, unless that's not your intent whatsoever to make something that is competitive, you're trying more so to make something that's more fun and whatever, like LOL so random XD. Like unless that's the case, I don't see where you're where you get off on putting this RNG in the game. And I don't think that you would. I think if you removed all RNG and you had a very more deterministic or simple approach to designing the game, or if you minimize the impact of RNG, like if you had it based on height advantage like StarCraft, that would still be flawed. It would still be not my favorite thing in the world. But at the very least, we would be able to control for far more mechanics in the game. And that, to me, would have been a lot better for just the end user experience in terms of being able to plan for certain things. One of the things that was really annoying was there's this one point where my hero was pretty low. And I think if the tower had gone down with him in it, he was in the tower so that he would regenerate faster, which I don't think is tooltipped anywhere, but maybe it is in the third game. At the very least, it was a rule for, I think, all of the titles, at the very least, the second game. And so one of the things that I did is I had him in the tower. That tower happened to be under attack. I don't think I had the resources to try to repair it or anything. And so I was keeping watch of the tower's HP so that I could unload him at the appropriate time. Because if the tower goes down and units are in it, the units get damaged. And I don't know how much damage gets transferred to them. I don't know what the rules are surrounding that. But he was sufficiently low that I thought maybe he'll die. Or in the aftermath, he'll be so wounded that if he tries to go fight and I'm not able to pull him away fast enough, he will definitely die to the units that are attacking the tower. You can't plan around that. That's obviously a very specific case, but I think it helps to underscore, give you a real world, real game example of what this RNG does to the player experience, where you can't control for when the tower goes down because the damage is all random. And not only are the damage values themselves randomized, but whether or not they critically strike, whether or not they completely miss and deal 1 damage, whether or not they, as a normal hit, I don't know. Like that stuff is really completely random. And you can say that you can influence it based on combat, but there's so many units in the game. There's 16 different races. There's so a crazy number of unit diversity, and that this is all in the game's favor until it's not. Until you have to keep in mind the combat skill and the damage values of all of these different units, oftentimes at the same time. So, the skirmishes were pretty varied, and that was one thing, again, that was in the game's favor from an aesthetic standpoint, from a fantasy setting standpoint, from feeling like you were enthralled and entrapped in a large-scale conflict with a bunch of different races involved, and that was cool. But in many specific cases where it came down to small numbers, it came down to a coin toss, that's not what you want it to come down to. You want it to come down to pre-planning, to proper knowledge of the game, to proper execution, proper micro. You want this stuff to be in the player's hands and not in some game engine's hands that is not disclosed to the player in any respect, and you have to go troll a wiki or get people to tell you what the hell's going on in your stream chat. That's not how you want to do your game. That's not how you want to run your show, in my opinion. So I hope that I've at least made a compelling case, more so than maybe when I was a bit more upset in the moment, and maybe I used too much superlative language that didn't help get my point across, but hopefully I was able to more accurately this time around. And you can make up your own mind based on that, whether or not it's a reasonable complaint. But I think it is. I don't think that you can justify the degree of RNG in this particular title. And hopefully it is minimized in some other productions like The Protectors, or at the very least, end users, developers can go in the game rules and change it themselves if they disagree with that sort of approach that the developers, in this case, of the base title had. So we'll see a little bit more about that later on. I think that going back to the art a little bit, I know there's been a little bit all over the place, but the various races, like Dark Elves and Wood Elves and High Elves, for example, they did have more custom art. The Orcs, Minotaurs, Barbarians, and all that, those guys have their own buildings now as well. That's completely separate. I think the Dwarves and Dark Dwarves are completely distinct as well. So in that respect, I feel like the art direction was certainly far improved, and it helped for readability. It also helped for like an understanding of the thematic of each race, and the fantasy of what the race is meant to be, and how to communicate that. I felt like that was aided and abetted by the fact that they did add all of this extra graphical content, and something that probably should have been in the game to begin with. However, there is still the problem of the sound design. Again, I do want to underscore once again that the fact that there were so many reused missile impact sounds, missile firing sounds, and the fact that there's a lot of occlusion going on with trees and other units that made it very difficult to see, where a unit was. They didn't really solve that in any respect. They didn't try to draw, transparency or something when a unit was underneath it, or anything else that maybe the engine was simply too limited to do, but certainly would have gone a long way to improving the readability of the game at a glance. And especially when you have the RNG that I just ranted about, you really don't have much. There's not too much that you can do more than include all that RNG to obscure and obfuscate the way that the game's engagements are going to go. And yet they still manage to they still manage to continue to annoy me and continue to disrupt the visual interaction of the title and the audible interaction of the title. So it was really difficult to know what was going on at any particular given time. Hopefully this is again resolved to some degree, or at the very least tackled and attempted to be resolved by some of the user-made content out there. And so I definitely think that the story, like I mentioned earlier, was not really a major focus of the game developers. It's very short, the main quest, and very surface level. It mostly seems to serve as a way to encourage players to move around the map and experience the breadth of the game's content. But I definitely think that the main design points of this title, like I mentioned earlier, where they're trying to control for multiple different playstyles, but they don't really, jack of all trades is a master of none kind of deal. In that particular case, in order to really experience Battlecry 3, you have to play it a few different times, and you have to play it with different races and different classes, and going down different paths, and checking out all the stuff that you missed the first time, and seeing what else you can find in the bonuses list, seeing what else you can max out, and all that stuff. So to that extent, I feel like they did a pretty decent job of making a title that was replayable. And say what you will about the RNG, perhaps it does make certain kinds of players want to retry a certain mission and see if they get any luckier that time, see if they the luck is on their side, and then they can smell leather and tell you how good its texture is. I don't know. That's a reference that only the Brood War guys will get, but that's fine. That's all I got for you for the Battlecry 3 game. Like I did say, I am going to be running the Protectors some point next week if all goes well, but we will see. We will see when you will see me again. Thank you for joining me. If you have any final thoughts, you want to respond to anything in this review, you want to point out how I'm wrong, or just tell me about how good looking I am, I don't know, whatever you feel like doing, you know where to do that in the comments section below. And feel free to educate me on something that maybe I explicitly said I was not aware of, or maybe I said something that was incorrect in a factual sense, like talking about the game's engine or something. Feel free to let me know what I got wrong, and maybe where there's gaps in my knowledge in that particular respect. You might know more than I do in that respect, so I do appreciate everybody who contributes in that respect. Respect, respect, respect. There, I said it 3 more times because 3. I'll see you later.